Thanks for staying with us. Former Egyptian Foreign Minister Amr Moussa says Africa should find ways to tackle causes of coups on the continent. He says Africa could ensure that democratic institutions are effective. Moussa, who is a former Arab League Secretary General, has called for permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The African peer review mechanism is marking its 20th anniversary in Sandton, and SABC News reporter Khayelihle Khumalo is covering that particular story and joins us live now. Kay, thank you so much for your time. Now, this, of course, is a self-assessment mechanism, and we've seen it over time when it comes to the work of the African Union. But let's talk about how much of an effective tool when it comes to democracy and governance around the continent.
It's a very vital instrument, especially when you talk about the issues of instilling those very good values in the continent, to have regular elections, to have the culture of good governance, but also tackling the issues of corruption as well, making sure that gender parity as well is prioritized by the member states. So when they look at their own scorecard, really, Bongiwe, they do say that there are areas where they've done exceptionally well, but there are areas as well where they could have done better, where, you know, the very great deal of concern from so many countries, especially when you look at West Africa, where we've seen a tsunami of coups, where we've seen attempted coups in countries like Sierra Leone. And in fact, their president is due to land in South Africa. He's going to take part in some of these celebrations, especially because he's heading the AU Presidential Forum that is looking at the African peer review mechanism.
Now, when you talk about, you know, good governance, you look at, especially when you talk about what is taking place in West Africa, how do they begin to have a conversation about that? Because 20 years on, yes, they can talk about the successes, but the successes will be hindered, particularly by what we're seeing in West Africa.
Well, that's absolutely right, Bongo, especially because, I mean, one of the very primary questions that came out during the plenary was, what are the root causes of these coups? Is it because these are fragile democratic states, or democracy really is not effective, or there are weaknesses where they're not able to penetrate to the people, making sure that it becomes an effective way of governance? So those are some of the issues that the delegates were ironing out, in terms of also addressing the issues of divisions in the continent, looking at diversity, how to make sure that diversity becomes a very positive tool as opposed to being a weakness.
But also there's, you know, one thing that keeps coming up over time. Apart from regular elections, we know, you know, what the situation became in Zimbabwe, but there's another issue that also appears to be a thorny one, particularly when it comes to this review mechanism, is the issue of strong institutions in the various countries that they will be looking at, you know, and assessing. Those particular countries, how many of them right now can they say do have strong institutions to ensure effective governance, effective, you know, democracy as well?
It's a very pertinent question, Bongiwe, especially because, you know, when you look at the context of the African states, I mean, they've got myriad of weaknesses when it comes to governance, when it comes to the issues of making sure that democracy really works for the people, that it becomes a very good mechanism of achieving all these aspirations, ideals that oftentimes are being spoken about. So that was one of the very key areas that was explored by the delegates, making sure that how can they really make sure that democracy, good governance, but all these other key ingredients are really put together so that we see a very successful African state, so that even when there are certain, you know, areas that are really just coming out or just making a room for a coup or attempted coup, you know, how do they try and counter that? Because by saying democracy is working, then the population, then they can see that, well, there's no need for a change of government, for the military to move away from the barracks to go to the state house. So that was one of the very key issues that was being looked at in terms of really bringing that strength. In fact, it was one of the main issues by the former South African Deputy President Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, saying that if a country is broken, where there is no good governance, then you do have the women bearing the brunt of those issues, the children, the most vulnerable people, you know, within societies. And
how far are they in the issues around gender parity? Because that also is one of the big issues on the continent.
absolutely massive issue in the continent. But what we know so far is that when it comes to the political representation in terms of the national assemblies in Africa, I think the numbers are quite good. When it comes to the cabinet appointment, we see in some of the most powerful positions where the female leaders are in charge, but it's right within the private sector where you still have these disparities, where you still do have these massive challenges. And there was that question of really just bringing the synergies where, you know, the political office bearers can work with the private sector, but also making sure that the legislative instruments are being used to make sure that they really get this right.
Because it's always the policies, but implementation is always just as critical. But also looking at some of the work that they've done, one can see there's a number of strides that have been made. And I wonder very briefly then, what becomes the successes?
I think really what becomes a success is, I mean, there are some nations in Africa where there are regular elections, where also even the political opponents and all the stakeholders do accept the outcomes, but also making sure that everything is transparent in terms of the electoral bodies, but also some countries that are willing to say, African peer review mechanism is all about making sure that the peers are reviewing what we do. Are we getting the service delivery right? What are the areas of weaknesses? Where can we improve? There are some countries that are quite receptive in terms of the constructive criticism, but also there are quite a number of countries where such political developments, really we haven't seen much in terms of them being amenable to the changes, but also for the recommendations from the APRM once they come out, are they really just being implemented to the core? That's still another big issue. And
a huge issue, especially when you look at some of the institutions in these very own countries as to whether or not these governance institutions are strong, are effective, are in fact doing what they're supposed to be doing. But thank you so much, Kaya, because I do understand there's a lot more celebrations throughout the week. We'll continue then to watch the story develop through your eyes. That is Khayelihle Khumalo, SABC News reporter.